Welcome to Just One Q, the podcast where we explore the latest ideas in workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion in conversation with thought leaders and experts. Each episode, a guest and I dive into a question that highlights their area of expertise. And the goal is to leave you with tools and insights that you can use to make your workplace better and more human-friendly. I'm your host, Dominique. I'm a DEI educator and advocate working for Dialectic, an inclusive workplace learning consultancy in lovely Guelph, Ontario, which is situated on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional lands of the Chinooktun and the Haudenosaunee peoples. Today, my guest is Natasha Sharma. Hi, Natasha.
Hi, Dom. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Dom. I appreciate it.
Natasha is a certified life and business coach, a wellness specialist, a mentor, entrepreneur, and a visionary DEI professional. She's also a very dynamic and sought after public speaker and trainer with over a decade of experience advancing social justice and wellness conversations. And as the founder and CEO of Power in Progress, a global consultancy dedicated to personal, professional, and organizational growth, Natasha is committed to helping individuals and institutions unlock their full potential through inclusive, purpose-driven strategies. Power in Progress delivers tailored solutions that bridge the gap between equity and impact and embrace inclusion as a driver of innovation and resilience. Natasha holds a master's degree in public administration from the University of Liverpool Management School, and she has become a trusted advisor across sectors, known for transforming complex challenges into opportunities for growth and development. Their work is anchored in authenticity, empowerment, and systems thinking, and influences positive change at the intersection of equity, leadership, and transformation. Natasha, welcome again to the show.
Wow, thank you so much, Dom, for that lovely introduction. Sometimes when things are written on paper or read out loud, I don't realize how much I've actually done in the
Yeah,
span of social justice career here. Yeah.
absolutely. That is a very common reaction that I get when I read people's bios back to them. We all have them, and then to hear them aloud, we feel pretty accomplished. But yes, you're very well deserving of all of the things that are in that bio, and I'm very happy to have you here today. The main question that we're going to use to guide our conversation today is how can we build strong intergenerational teams in the workplace? And we're talking about this because age and generational difference have become a strong area of focus for many organizations who have sort of immediate concerns about equity and also longer term strategic concerns about future proofing their business and attracting and retaining top talent. So, anyone who has these concerns right now, whether that's in HR, learning and development, management, or leadership roles, has access to a lot of information pointing to generational differences. And one of the key areas of difference that's pointed out in pop business content are sort of generalizations. So, for example, what people want from work. We would assume that boomers are workaholics and Gen Z want more compensation, for example. You can Google that right now and find a dozen articles that would point to those sort of differences generationally. So, Natasha, I would love for you to help us separate the noise from the substance here. Do people from different generations have very different standards and expectations in the workplace?
Yes, I think that that's absolutely true. And I don't actually think that it's necessarily a problem, right? So there's many articles that will speak to the fact that, boomers or Gen Xers are people who have this ancient way of thinking or adapting to transformation within an organization. And in fact, when I think about intergenerational collaboration, I think about it like it's a cross-cultural experience.
Mm,
So when we're discussing different generations, it's important that each generation has their own values and their own communication styles and their own ways of working, and that their expectations are, of course, in the inclusion space, it's always shaped by, our social, economic, and political environment and the ways that we've been raised or the ways that we've been brought up. And I think that generational identity is actually, when we consider it, it's a part of our culture. It's
mm,
embedded in our culture, right? It's
yeah,
shaped
yeah.
by our media, the forms of education we've had, our economic conditions, and even something as simple and personal as our parenting styles. So when we think about when a boomer expects this formality, and I put quotations around that because I feel like it's a lot of articles and published journals speak to these nuances in differing various generations, and boomers are always outlined or seen as people or professionals who think about formality and punctuality.
Yeah.
Whereas on the flip end of that conversation, Gen Z staffers are often seen as people who assume they want casual conversations and these flexible deadlines, and they want to work from home. And it's not necessarily a form of disrespect because people say that boomers feel offended or
Mm.
Gen Zers or millennials feel offended on the other side of that spectrum. I just think it's a culture clash.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that framing. It's not something that we often hear in those articles, is treating it with the same amount of respect that you would treat other elements of diversity or that kind of identity based or cultural based difference. So that's a really great invitation just to start thinking about it as, yeah, there are differences, but it's a lot like culture in that it's muddy, it's complicated, it is collective, but it's also highly individual and up to interpretation, right?
Absolutely. And it's important that professionals in their own right, so people who are pushing organizational transformation, growth and development, it's important to ensure that employers, organizations, staff, et cetera, leadership teams, that they know about cultural competency and what that means.
Mm,
And I think it's important to just be overall just personally aware of our own worldviews.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, and I think it's important to ask very clear questions to one another within an organization. So, like, for example, what has shaped our work values? And just understanding that on a team, it's important, and just maintaining a positive attitude toward our differences. And I know earlier you had spoken about respect and
Mm.
what respect means when we're talking about cultural competency. And I think it's important to seek and learn and try to gain more understanding and knowledge around intergenerational collaboration and what that means. And
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah. So that I like again the language of cultural competency when we apply that to generational difference, I think that's such an interesting application of that concept. Can you maybe break that down a little bit for us? Like what does cultural competency mean and how can we use it to frame our approach?
for example, some older workers may view respect as a deference to hierarchy, like, ooh, did she just say that? I'm the
Yeah.
manager. I'm the director in this room. While younger colleagues might also define it as being heard, like their sense of respect is being heard in a room,
Mm,
feeling included regardless of their title. So I think that it's important when we're discussing cultural competency, we understand everyone's varying perspectives, right?
right.
And we can avoid this sense of disrespect or miscommunication by simply asking direct questions like team building activities, like what does respect look like to you?
Mm.
Right? That one question can diffuse a lot of tensions and also build many bridges.
Yeah, I love that idea. I think it's a very powerful exercise, even just to recognize that each person is a cultural being, and that includes me, right? And so taking a minute to also acknowledge before I, you know, evaluate my colleagues that I also am a cultural being and that my perspective of others is going to be shaped by all of those factors and the way that I grew up. And my perspective isn't neutral. So I like that idea of kind of cultural relativity can be that foundation for respect. And you're absolutely right. Like it's just a shift in attitude. And all of a sudden, when you think about intergenerational difference as cultural, you can be encouraged to like gain knowledge about other cultural practices and worldviews. And that could mean, interacting with reading materials or media or, having conversations with people who are different ages than you and viewing that as a cultural exchange, I think is just like, that's so cool. And what a great and positive approach to the tension of intergenerational collaboration.
Absolutely. I think you framed that really well in the sense of just understanding your own cultural competency is important. And once we start doing that within organizations, we're able to understand everybody else's viewpoints as well, or at least try to understand everybody's viewpoints. And that's what we all aim for when we're discussing intergenerational collaboration and intergenerational differences, right? I remember there was a workshop that I had led where we had asked participants to define their idea of professionalism
Mm,
and what this idea of professionalism means. And some of the answers ranged from, suits and titles to being responsive and reliable.
mm,
And that exercise had opened up a whole can of worms within the room that I was standing in because it kind of shifted perception. We all may have the same intentions within an organization. We're all working towards similar goals, similar work projects, similar deadlines. And I think that everyone had realized that the intentions were all aligned, but the way that we express ourselves look differently.
right. Yeah, that's a really powerful realization. I love that example. Another difference or point of tension that comes up a lot, and this is, if you're Googling intergenerational differences, I'm guaranteeing you're going to find an article in the top 10 about this. And it's this idea of technological change. And this is an area where people seem to have very strong stereotypes. We tend to ascribe technological savvy to younger generations, and we think of older generations as not being able to adapt. And this is a very common way that we talk about people. So I'm wondering if we can just chat through that a little bit. So how are different generations experiencing technological change in the workplace?
I think that it's such a common myth that and it's important that we hone in on that because there are a lot of published articles that are out there framing older generations as struggling to adapt with technology. But in reality, I think that every generation experiences some level of disruption and some level of a need for a learning curve when new tools are being introduced or new systems are being introduced into the workplace. And sometimes older generations wear that.
Mm,
And when I say older, I'm going to put that in quotations as well. Like boomers and Gen Xers, they wear that badge of, oh, I don't know if I should learn this new technology or I'm going to put it off and push it down the line because everyone says we're not going to understand it. And I think it's important that we peel back those layers and understand that intergenerational collaboration when it comes to technology is really about learning and transforming together and understanding, again, like we spoke about cultural competency, just understanding that everyone is capable and everyone is adaptable.
yeah, absolutely. Something that I think about sometimes is this idea of somebody in my parents' generation, the amount of transformation that they have experienced in the course of their lifetime
Absolutely.
exceeds the amount of transformation that I have seen in mine. They've been along for the ride as professionals for my whole period of change and all of the technologies that have happened in my lifetime. But then they also had, the advent of the internet and, really wildly transformative things. So it's like, going to the library and looking at old microfiche articles and things to find information. That's like how things were done. And so the amount of transformation there is just really huge. Is there anything that you would say to employees or to leaders when they're thinking about introducing new technologies or adopting some sort of transformative technology in the workplace? How should we be thinking about that? And should generations and generational skill factor into how we think about that?
I think yes and no. So I think that generational skills should factor into any rollout of any new technology with an organization. But I think it's also important to have conversations and ensure there's opportunities across organizations to ensure that there is a way or an avenue for people to train, to learn the technology, to not feel like they're being left out of any rollout of programs. It's important for leadership. I really do believe that it starts from the top, right? So if we are constantly using our words to make people feel like, I don't know if I should do it, X said that, it's more for the younger staff, right? Like when you hear things like that, it
Yeah.
makes people feel like, oh, that's not for me then. I'm not a part of that, right? So younger generations may be fluent in the idea of digital culture, like social media, texting, collaborative platforms when we work on Microsoft Teams, et cetera, Zoom, et cetera. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're always going to be comfortable with these professional systems, right? On the flip end of that, I think that it's important when these articles are publishing information that Gen Zs and millennials are often seen as these digital natives. And they're so quick on social media and they're so quick on their smartphone apps, but they're also very overwhelmed by corporate platforms when we're talking about CRMs, databases, et cetera, which people who are considered as boomers or categorized as boomers or Gen Xers, they may have a plethora of experience in that. So that's where I think that the other side of that conversation, when we're talking about Gen X and boomers, might be slower to adapt to this new app, but they often bring this deep understanding of systems thinking and adaptability, right? Like you mentioned it earlier, many of them have transitioned from typewriters to personal computers, right? PCs. And then you talked about the idea of dial-up internet and high-speed internet, fiber optics. There's so many things that we can talk about nowadays. And I remember as a young child living in an intergenerational home, my mother had a typewriter in the house. And I remember my sister and I playing with this typewriter like we thought it was this ancient piece of technology that it had existed. And it was fascinating to me that we could type. And my mom had brought it to us saying, you all should really learn how to type as fast as you can and try to do it correctly.
Yeah.
And I thought it's fascinating that we could just press these buttons on this typewriter and it would automatically print, right? Because we would put
Yeah.
in paper through. And when I was thinking about this idea of intergenerational collaboration, so many different thoughts came through. I was at the cusp of the millennial categorization where I kind of lived through the transition of dial-up internet when if you wanted to make a call from the landline, you would hear that weird sound because the internet was being used. And I remember my father always trying to make sure that myself and my siblings always had access to these new forms of technology, be it floppy disks. Do you remember floppy
I
disks?
sure
And
do. Yep.
yeah, like saving our reports on floppy disks, then going into school and going to work on the PCs in the computer lab and printing things out. So I think that is a prime example. It's a personal example of how technology is so adaptable and how it's come a long way. And no matter what, every generation is going to adapt, right? So
Mhm.
technological disruption, it's not new.
Mm.
And it's definitely not new for boomers or Gen Xers, right?
Yeah.
They've, like
Yeah.
you said, they've lived through that shift from typewriters and then PCs. And then if we think about fax to email as well, that's
Oh,
an
yeah.
important piece. And then now I guess the adaption from floppy disk would be saving things on the cloud, right?
Yep.
So um,
And managing all of that. Yeah.
absolutely. And I think that we've all kind of proven that we can adapt as a society and as organizations roll out new technology.
Yeah, I love this take. I feel like it's really empowering. And I think it's refreshing to hear that because I am in a like an elder millennial, if you must know. And I feel like, it's often assumed that because I'm a digital native, technically, or I guess at least technological rollouts happened when they were grade appropriate. So it just felt native. Like as, you know, as I was able to use a computer, there were computers and so on. But really, there are assumptions made about you're going to be great with AI, right? And it's like that is a brand new technology and a brand new skill set. And I'm certainly seeing on my team, it's not necessarily age that determines skill in that area. And we're all learning together. And I think that's a really great reminder that, you know, these technologies aren't in our blood. We're not necessarily, you know, born to be good at them. And there's a lot of wisdom in that systems thinking piece. I love that from older generations who have experienced multiple sets of transformation and can draw lessons from that experience and can, you know, frame their approaches to technology with that wisdom, which I think is super, it's a really positive spin on this whole thing.
Absolutely. I think that you hit the nail on the head there, Dom, with regards to being a millennial and being kind of labeled a part of the generations and generations after us who are going to be amazing with AI. I'm here like, I'm not that great. And sometimes I say, like, I know people who are boomers that are amazing with AI right now, and I'm learning from them, right?
Hmm.
And I remember that one of the most productive IT training sessions that I sat in was when I was paired with an older or more seasoned IT professional that had more seniority within my organization. And I remember as a younger staff member, I helped that individual navigate a new platform within our organization. And while that same older staffer had helped me understand the long-term goals of why it's important to use CRMs and to make sure that we're saving things onto the cloud and how important that is to the organization's long-term goals. Something as simple as like, if I'm not well and they have to access something, just having things on my personal phone or work phone with regards to work content or filming content, it's not feasible.
Hmm.
And the reason why that use of CRMs or Laserfiche, I remember that back in the day, saving things to that are important because that's the database that was being used at the time. So I think it's really about an idea of mutual respect,
Yeah,
right? So we can learn from each other. That's a common theme there. And like real collaboration is about adaptation across the board and adaptability across the board. So I often think that it's important instead of focusing on who's behind us or who's falling behind, it's important that we focus on how generations can learn best, right? So boomers might need some in-person training sessions or virtual training sessions, whereas Gen Zs and millennials might be able to just look at the platform and kind of understand or kind of figure it out on their own. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just, I think organizations and leadership need to be aware that there are different nuances in how people can adapt and learn technology in the workplace.
absolutely. Yeah, no, that's really great. Thanks for chatting tech because I think, you know, it's such a major everyday thing that we all have to deal with. And it's the, you know, collaboration happens through tech these days in many workplaces. And so it's a really powerful example, I think. Something else that, you know, happens in workplaces, and I work among people who are very well versed in DEI and who have really strong core values about inclusion. And yet, as a group, we still sometimes fall into playing the who has it worse game about generational difference. And this is a very common way that we talk about generational difference in society at large. You know, it's the whole I had to walk uphill both ways in the snow
Oh,
from school. You know, that type of rhetoric where we compare our generational experience to other generations and we are always thinking, you know, we had it worse and those generations need to pipe down. So, I'm wondering what is the right response when this kind of conversation comes up at work?
I think that it's important to consider that that kind of conflict is so much more common than we think. And it's not to be taken personally, or it shouldn't be taken personally when it comes up at work, right? So I've heard so many statements like, back in my day, we worked for for example, half the pay that you work for now, or on the flip side of that conversation, you all had it easy. Housing was more affordable. I know housing is a huge conversation with Gen Zs and millennials right now. And I don't think that being a part of a discussion in this competition of pain, so when we consider the who had it worse conversation, it really is, when you break it down, it's a competition of pain between different generations. And I don't think anybody wins in that case. And I think that that is doing an injustice to different generations within an organization. And I think that instead, we really should start to focus on validating that each generation is going to be different no matter what, right? When we talk about cultural competency, et cetera, respect in the workplace. And it's not necessarily a terrible thing. So if we reframe the way that we think about things, for example, if we're talking about boomers and Gen Xers, and, you know, they were faced with some serious job insecurity back in the day during the recessions. And often they weren't necessarily thinking about mental health and wellness and access to that in the
Mm-hmm.
workplace. Whereas millennials, we've entered the workforce at a time where I believe that it's been proven that millennials have the most amount of student debt. Uh, yeah, so I see you shaking your head, Dom.
Yeah.
So, and
Yeah.
uh, and then Gen Zs, when we think about that generation, we're thinking about the fact that they're growing in an era where they're concerned about climate change, climate anxiety, global instability, and just overall digital burnout. So when we're talking about this competition of pain, it's important to understand that people can talk about their disadvantages, right? In various ways, but it doesn't mean that any one disadvantage is better than the other, right? And when I hear these kinds of tensions, I always personally try to shift the conversations from who had it worse to how are we experiencing this moment differently, right? And what can we actually learn from each other within this organization? And I think that it's important to ensure that we're moving away from this competition of pain because it's not productive, it's not transformative. And once we start to understand that everyone has a viewpoint and everyone is going to feel certain ways, we can actually collaborate together, right? And that's what intergenerational collaboration is about. It's about collaborating together, understanding everyone's differences, respecting each other. And I think that would be my best advice for leadership is to ensure that you're having these conversations among your workspaces, to your personal teams on a more corporate level, organizational level, and it's top down, right? So these ideologies, these attitudes, these perspectives, it starts from the top. And I think leaders are a great way to start. So when we're talking about old school versus new school and these ideologies, it's important to kind of peel back the layers to that, help teams understand why these thoughts happen. And essentially, it's to have good training around intergenerational collaboration in the workforce.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that idea that like a competition of pain, there's just no winners in it. And that we can, by sort of validating the challenges that each generation has faced, actually learn stuff from that and try to, instead of one-upping, just distill how has that shaped your experience of the current moment and just flipping it to have this more empathetic approach. I think that's such a powerful thing. And, we don't take these conversations very seriously. I feel like we often just engage in them in a teasing or banter kind of way. And it's a point of identity that isn't very taboo compared to, obviously, we can't go joking about race or religion or other factors. And so generation just feels like safe. It feels like a safe place to sort of have that teasing banter. But I think we're losing out. Like what I'm hearing is that conversation actually has some potency in it, that we could be leveraging some of the information in that experience to make our teams stronger. So it's a very cool insight.
Absolutely. You spoke to the idea of empathy, and that stuck out to me. Leading with empathy, leading with connection is important. I recall that a mentor of mine had once said that the idea of shared struggle, it doesn't mean equal struggle,
Mm,
right? It means that if we have this idea of empathy for what the other person is carrying, we're able to grow and transform as a community. And I think that it's important to think about intergenerational collaboration in a way where we're being curious about it and we're trying to understand more about it and appreciate that diversity of perspectives, right?
yeah. Yep.
And understand that diversity is actually our superpower and it's any organization's superpower. And the faster that we lean into that, we understand cultural competency, we understand respect in the workplace, inclusion, leadership training on what intergenerational collaboration means and the different nuances within our organizations and how we can apply that on our day to day team meetings or our day to day encounters with our colleagues, then we can understand that diversity and these differing perspectives are our superpower. And it's not meant to be a stumbling block. It's
Mm.
not meant to be this competition of power between individuals.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that idea. And I'd love to lean into that a little bit. So I'm going to ask you, what can we actually gain from intergenerational difference or even some of that friction that we've talked about?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So when I consider the idea of friction, scientifically, when we speak about friction, friction creates this heat like energy, right? So I don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing to have friction within the workplace, but I do think that it's important that it's managed intentionally and intergenerational differences can lead to transformative growth in the workplace. So, for example, in my professional experience with two-way mentoring programs in the workplace, it can be incredibly powerful and it's often the most successful. So when we're talking about a boomer who might be mentoring a Gen Z employee on leadership, while that same Gen Z colleague can share tips and personal branding ideas to help like leverage emerging technology, how to market certain things, how to create digital ads, etc. I think that it's important that both parties are walking away with something. They're walking away more confident, more connected, feeling smarter about a topic that they may not have felt confident about in the past. And that's really important.
Yeah, that's such a great example. And then I guess the other thing is that, sometimes there's sort of a clash of values that happens among different generations. What is that clash of values good for? Like, are there any positives that can spin out of that?
I think so. I think that when we're thinking about a clash of values or these value based conversations, that's an approach that I would recommend a lot of organizations consider this value of conversations. We talked about two-way mentoring, right? And this friction often reveals what matters most to people. So when we think about friction, yes, it creates this energy of heat, this energy of conflict, this negativity within the organization, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. So once we process those emotions or those feelings, it can create connection and understanding. So, for instance, if a younger employee may want to push more climate policies or mental health policies within their HR departments, and I think this is actually challenging organizations toward adaptability and transformation in a meaningful way. It's not necessarily a negative thing, but a lot of the times people who may be receiving these forms of feedback within their organization, they might be like, "Oh, that's a little bit too progressive or too modern for our organization. Our organization doesn't do that." And I think that it's important to lean into that idea of learning from each other. So maybe this person actually has a point here. Let me do some research on this. Let me understand why it's so important to them. And maybe we can talk about it as a team. Maybe we can ensure that when we go to leadership with this idea, that we do our research, we put together a briefing note, et cetera, to ensure that everyone's equipped well. So just engaging in those conversations are important. And Another approach that I would recommend is the idea of norm shifting. And when we're considering this idea of shifting within our workplace, we're considering transformation. We're considering intergenerational dialogue, which helps to guide people. So, for example, when we're talking about rigid hierarchies within an organization, we can also consider that burnout exists within an organization and work-life balance is important to different generations within an organization. And I think that debunking or just peeling back the layers to these rigid hierarchies, it's important to understand that organizations are continuously moving towards transformation, organizational change, and growth and development, right?
Mm.
And that leads me into my last approach here, which I would recommend organizations consider this idea of future proofing, right? And it's kind of a way of, folding in two-way mentoring, value-based conversations, and norm shifting together into one to ensure that when we're listening to the next generation, we're not just meeting their needs, but we're able to learn from their needs, understand the intergenerational conversations and dialogues that need to take place in order for the organization to thrive. And I think it's important because leaning into these different perspectives is what's going to drive intergenerational collaboration.
Mm. Yeah. And of course, the next generation is going to inherit these businesses, these organizations. So we need to make sure that in terms of future proofing, there's a path forward and that people want to participate, but they also can't participate without the wisdom that exists within these organizations that then needs to be handed down from people who've been around. So I love that. I love that idea of the two things blending together and not necessarily finding the middle. That's not it, right? It's not about washing out the difference. It's
Yeah,
about sort of capitalizing on, okay, what are these norms telling us or these values? Like, let's dig into it. And also, how can we apply that transformationally across the business so that it's just stronger on the whole as we move into the future? It's a very cool concept. I like this idea of future proofing a lot.
absolutely. Like I remember there was a moment a few years back when a millennial employee had voiced that they didn't necessarily want to be on call. And this was during the pandemic, right? And they didn't want to be on call after hours because, of course, work-life balance. And an older manager, I remember them vividly, specifically scoffing, like out loud. And I thought, oh, okay, that person's not comfortable with this. But after a few conversations, she ultimately had admitted that the reason why she scoffed is because back in her day, and I have to keep putting quotations because,
Yes.
I don't necessarily think that this individual was old, but back in her day, she never could speak up about that work-life balance. And it sparked this nuanced conversation about how our team started to communicate with each other and creating healthier policies. And it actually catapulted into an actual policy that was created where you did not have to respond to emails or take calls after your working hours, your specific hours. And I think that's a great example of when we start to embrace these intergenerational differences and open up dialogue and leave space for these conversations, we're not just tolerating each other, which you spoke to, right? Like we're transforming together as communities, as organizations. And I think that it's important to lean towards evolving towards cultures of inclusion. And that's important, right? Cultures of inclusion, ensuring that it's embedded into policies, understanding overall belonging, making sure that there's room for team discussions, team socials that are including people of all generations and considering people of all generations in a social event, ensuring we have lunch and learns, et cetera. There's so many different programmings that organizations can have to build that team rapport, that organizational rapport, and embrace intergenerational collaboration within the workforce.
I love it. Natasha, I'm going to wind this conversation down, but I want to thank you so much for your presence here today and for chatting with me about intergenerational collaboration. It's been very fun, and I thank you for bringing some new concepts in here for me and for our listeners. I really value your insights.
Thank you so much for having me. And I have really valued and appreciated being a subject matter expert for this training. And I've loved the conversation today. And I think it's an important conversation to ensure that leadership and organization know that intergenerational collaboration is the future of adaptability and transformation within organizations.
Absolutely. I will drop some links to Natasha's website and socials in the show notes below, so please be sure to check out her work at Power in Progress. And as always, I welcome any of our listeners to reach out to me if you'd like to be a featured guest on this podcast or if you'd like to nominate someone. My email address is in the show notes too. And if you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating and a review or share this episode to your own socials. It really does help get the podcast into more ears. I'm Dominique. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time on Just One Q.